Now that we've gone over some of the background information that forms the basis for maybe our philosophy of the way we translate, some of the core values we hold to in translation, those being accuracy, naturalness, clarity. Now we would like to take a look at Scripture and walk through the process of maybe of a simple narrative passage to kind of get an idea of where we start from and where we end up, and why possibly it looks a little bit different than what maybe we anticipated it. First of all, what I'd like to do is I'd like to read from Genesis 37, verses 2 through 4, and I'd like to read that in the ESV. Verse 2 starts out, "These are the generations of Jacob. Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives. And Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him." Okay, so the ESV being a literal version, that's what it would sound like. Now I would like to read to you what the end product is possibly going to sound like in the Moy, and this has been translated back into English so that we can get kind of an idea what it might sound like. This is the story about Jacob and his family. Now about this Jacob, he had many sons. Some were born from his wife Bilhah, some were born from his wife Zilpah, and then from another wife he had a son named Joseph. Now about this Joseph, when Joseph was still young, when he was 17 years old, he would take care of his father's sheep and goats. As he took care of them, he didn't do this by himself. He worked with his older brothers as well. He was working continuously like that until one day he came to Jacob and he said, "Father, my older brothers are behaving wickedly. They are doing very bad." This is what Joseph did. Now, continuing on, verse 3. Now about Jacob, he really loved Joseph. He loved all of his sons, but his love for Joseph was way up there of a different kind. Now, the reason he loved him like this is because Joseph had been born when Jacob was older, so that's why he loved him. And on the basis of that special love like that, Jacob made for him a long shirt that was amazingly beautiful. He made it like that, and he said, "Here, Joseph, this is for you." Having done it like that, Joseph's brothers became angry and were thinking, our father loves Joseph a lot. I don't like that, so I hate Joseph. And thinking that way, the brothers turned their faces from Joseph. They spoke only bad things to him, and they continually did like that. So, looking at that, if you just look at the size of it on your screens or wherever you happen to be viewing this, you can see that there's a tremendous difference, at least in the way it looks with our eyes anyway, of between the ESV, a literal version, and the Moy version, the way it turns out here in Moy. That may be a bit of a shock to some of us, but there's a reason behind it. And what we're going to do now is we're going to go back and we're going to look at the process that we went through, starting from our source language and moving all the way into the receptor language, why we got to where we did. And we'll just go through that step by step. Now, as I do the translation, go through the translation process, I've broken it down into 23 steps that I chart along the way to keep track of where I'm at with every single chapter. And I may not be in the same step for every chapter, so it takes a spreadsheet to kind of work through it and make sure that I'm doing everything I need to do for every chapter. And for myself personally, I broke that up into 23 steps. Other people, other organizations, they may do it differently. But if I could, I'll just walk with you very briefly through these 23 steps and give you an idea overall of what the picture looks like moving from the initial exegesis all the way to the final printing where you put it into their hands. So let's just take a look at that real quick. Step 1, read the portion through. Step 2, study the portion. Step 3, outline major sections. Step 4, Exegetical draft. Step 5, mother tongue draft. Step 6, mother tongue recording. Step 7, listen to the recording and edit. Step 8, content check. Step 9, develop comprehension check questions. Step 10, comprehension check number 1. Step 11, comprehension check number 2. Step 12, comprehension check number 3. Step 13, back translation. Step 14, content check. Step 15, translation consultant checks the back translation. Step 16, pre-check questionnaire. Step 17, notes and questions answered. Step 18, translation consultant checks translation. Step 19, final adjustments. Step 20, formatting. Step 21, final spell check. Step 22, first printing and distribution. Step 23, second edit, printing and distribution. Okay, so let's take a look at this process, moving from the exegetical draft to the final printing where you put it into people's hands. The process that we go through doing a translation. Step 1, read through the passage in a literal translation. Reading through this, and you familiarize with yourself, and at this point I begin to break it down into different propositions, the way the sentences relate to each other, and make note of that, kind of in some way preparing for the next step, which is step 2, outlining the passage and the way the whole chapter and the different paragraphs work together to form a single unit. Step 3, I go into deeper, in-depth study of the passage, and the way I do that is I look at other translations, reading through them, and I note differences between the translations. This alerts me to the fact that there are some complicated Greek structure or Hebrew structure that needs to be addressed, and I begin to look at translation helps during this time to help me make exegetical decisions about how I'm going to translate those particular parts. Step 4, this is when, after I've read it, I've outlined it, I've studied it exegetically, figured out how everything fits together, I now put it back together as an exegetical draft. This is, according to my understanding of Moy language, this is how I would translate this passage into the heart language of the Moy people. Step 5, mother tongue draft. This is where I take my exegetical draft and I interact with it with a native speaker to correct vocabulary, basically all the translation principles that we've talked about already, to correct vocabulary, sentence structure, the way clauses, propositions, the way sentences connect to each other. I work this over with a mother tongue speaker so that he can give me the clearest, most natural way to say these passages. That's step 5. Step 6, mother tongue recording. After he understands it, and we've made corrections, and we've gotten it to where we think this is what it needs to sound like in Moy, we then have him record it for me in a very, without him looking at the actual written passage, having him say the passage to me, and we make a recording of that. Step 7, after my language helper has gone home and I'm by myself, I will go back through, listen to the recording, compare it with my original exegetical draft, and make changes where needed, guarding accuracy all the time to make sure that it's communicating, again, accurate, clear, and natural. So that's what we're working on there. After that becomes step 8, which is the content check. This then, I give the mother tongue combination exegetical draft. I give this draft then to my coworker, who will go through the passage that we've worked on, and he will compare it once again with the source language to make sure that we are maintaining that accuracy all along the way. He's looking specifically for accuracy at that point. Then he will give this back to me, and I will take his corrections or suggestions, and I will incorporate them into the draft that we are now working with. That's the end of step 8. Step 9, which is develop comprehension check questions. This this is an important step in that when we ask questions, basically what we do is we're going to read this passage to another Moy speaker who has never heard it before. And we are going to ask them their comprehension of that passage. When we do that, we don't want to ask leading questions that make our translation look good. We want to ask questions that reveal if there's something wrong about the translation. So often we will have to think through questions ahead of time to make sure that we're not asking simple yes/no questions or why was that? Why questions. We're going to ask questions, according to Peter's words, he mentioned this, do you remember anything else about that? Questions that are kind of prompt their memory, and then we can interact with them about what they've heard and make corrections if something is miscommunicating. So step 9, developing comprehension check questions, then leads into step 10, which is our first comprehension check. Step 10, basically we sit down with a native speaker, a native Moy speaker, and we read through a chunk at a time. We don't read through a sentence at a time because anybody can repeat back a sentence at a time. We want to read through a chunk at a time, a complete thought, maybe a paragraph, and ask them to come back with what they hear from that passage that we've read to them. We're looking for, first of all, are they understanding the theme and the flow of logic in this section? Secondly, we're looking for details. Details come later. The most important thing is that they're following the theme through. After that, if they've forgotten some details, we can go back and talk about those or ask them specific questions. We do this with 3 translation helpers. So this would be step 10, 11, and 12. Now we're up in the translation process after we've checked it with 3 translation helpers at different times. I just want to make a point, an observation about this, or a point about this. Usually our first comprehension check that we do, we will use a native speaker who's perhaps a little bit sharper and can help us fix some problems that we are going to find in the translation. As it goes along, however, especially for our third comprehension check, we want to take somebody who represents the average intellectual level of the Moy people and see if it can be understood by the average populace. So it's very important to, these are graded comprehension checks too, and it's amazing. Each one will reveal something that needs to be corrected or adjusted. Now, moving into step number 13, which is back translation. The back translation, it's kind of a literal translation of the Moy translation back into English. A literal translation of the Moy translation back into English. The reason why we do this is the consultant who does not know Moy needs to be able to interact with our translation in order to check and make sure it's accurate, clear, and natural. Then we get to the 14th step, which is doing a content check. This is a content check of the back translation. We are checking to make sure that our back translation matches not what we hope it says or what we want it to say, but it actually matches what the Moy version says. After that, we're ready for our 15th step, where we send the back translation to a translation consultant. He's usually, he or she is usually someone who has done their own translation or is in the process of doing their own translation. They're very experienced with working with other languages, and they've had training on what to look for in a translation to make sure it meets the criteria that we're looking for. So we will send him this back translation. He reads through it, comparing it with the source language, comparing it with translation helps to make sure that we are indeed accurate. And because of his experience with the way languages work, often he's able to point out something that is not going to be very clear or not going to sound very natural based on his understanding of the way languages work. It's quite interesting. They're able to check it. They're able to check it quite thoroughly and even come up with some questions, things that we hadn't thought about that need to be changed. That's step 15. Step 16 then is a pre-check questionnaire. This is a questionnaire that the consultant sends to us before he actually comes and checks our translation, where we outline basically these steps that we've used, our helps that we've referred to, language helpers that we've used, and because he needs to make sure that when he comes and checks the translation, he's not using the same language helpers that we worked with, and that he understands a little bit of our process that we went through to get the translation that we did get. Often, there is something in that process that will help him understand why we came out with the translation that we came up with. That's the 16th step. 17. The translation consultant, as he looks at our BTs, he makes up a document called Notes and Questions. So the 17th step is answering these notes and questions that the consultant sends to the translator. The translator is alerted to different things that the consultant has noticed, made note of in the translation, and sometimes there's dialogue with the consultant over some of his suggestions, and maybe he asks us to give reason why we've translated something a certain way, proof for that, or he makes suggestions, and we look at the notes and questions and we answer them. We make some adjustments to the Moy translation in order to answer these questions. Now we get to step number 18. This is where the translation consultant actually comes into the village where we're at. He will sit down with us, with me, and maybe 2 or 3 other Moy speakers, and we will do another comprehension check, only this time it is the consultant checking the comprehension. He has me read a section at a time to the Moy guys that are there. So he'll say, okay, read verse 2 and 3. And I will read verse 2 and 3 to the Moy speakers. Then he will ask questions from them. He will say, okay, so what kind of talk is this? Tell me what you heard. The Moy speakers will then recite back to him what they understood from the passage, and he will do exactly what I did in comprehension checking. If there's things that they haven't come back with, that they misunderstand about theme or background or details, he'll ask about these and try to draw them out. And often during this time, it will reveal problems that have yet to be addressed that are directly related to accuracy, clarity, and naturalness. So anyway, this is a lengthy process. For the epistles, sometimes we can make it through 60 to maybe 80 verses in a day, checking it. Other times, if it's narrative, we try to aim for around 100 verses a day, sometimes more or less. So if we check 1,000 verses, it's going to take a good 10 days to 12 days to get through that. It's a lengthy process as well. That's the 18th step. The 19th step. During the translation check with the consultant, changes will come up, things that need to be changed or adjusted. And so this is where we get into the 19th step, which is the final adjustments. Is we go through it, making sure that the changes we made during the check are indeed what we want to have in the final printing. We make those changes. The 20th step is formatting. This is important as well. Just practically speaking, formatting it, the right size font, the right size book, perhaps putting some pictures in it for sections that are a little bit harder to understand. That's the formatting part of it. Step number 21 is a final spell check. My first spell check for Genesis portions, which was maybe 500 verses, it took me close to 2 weeks working through the spelling of the book of Genesis and other things that we were checking at that particular time to make sure that this represented a standardized spelling all the way through. So anyway, the initial spell check that we did with our initial portions took a great length of time because of certain factors with the Moy language and being very difficult to hear different sounds in the language. But now that our spelling has become more and more standardized, a lot of these corrections are made throughout this process, and now this final spell check, the time that it takes is greatly reduced, maybe in a day or a few hours. So, okay, now we're on to the 22nd step, I guess you could say. It's the first printing and distribution. This is where we, in the initial days, we're working with portions of Scripture that we've checked, maybe 500 verses, maybe 1,000 verses, maybe a part of a book, or maybe the book of Mark, something like that. And so we print up these booklets, and after they've been printed up, we distribute them to the Moy readers, those that can read Moy scriptures. Eventually, we need to embark on the 23rd step, which I've never done, which is combining all of these scripture portions, these scripture booklets that we've come up with, combining them into a single book, which would maybe be the Moy New Testament, doing a final spell check, final formatting, and then getting it printed by getting it printed off officially in a way, in a quality that's going to last a long time, and making that final distribution to the Moy readers. Just one more thing, when we get to that 23rd step, the time, let's just say we've completed all of our translation of the New Testament, and we're ready to start on the 23rd step. This typically takes 1.5 to 2 years. The reason why is we go back through and we do yet another comprehension check. Basically, our translation team gets together, we read through these scriptures once more to make sure that it really, truly is accurate, natural, clear, and then once we've made those final adjustments, then we're ready to print it for one last final time. So yes, those are the steps, and I think now you can understand why the average amount of time that it takes to translate a single verse into Moy is about 2 hours, between 1 hour and 45 minutes to 2 hours per verse. So, with all the different steps that I mentioned, from moving from initial study of the scripture portion that you're working on to the very final part of it where you're publishing it, there are those 23 steps. And in each chapter that you're working on in Scripture, you're going through those 23 steps, but not all at the same time. Some days you may be drafting new portions. Some days you may be working on comprehension checking. Sometimes you may be preparing something for a translation consultant. One of the tools that I use to keep track of all that is to have everything in a spreadsheet, every step along the way marked out, so that I can keep track of, for every chapter, just exactly which step in this process I am at with that chapter and what needs to come next. So now as we look at this chart, we can see that underneath the first step, which is to read the portion through, the second step, identifying the outline and propositions, after I completed each step, I would enter in there either the date that I did it or the fact that it had been done. I also, as we keep going along here, I got into the fifth step, which is the mother tongue draft. You can see that here I used a language helper by the name of Fufuye, and here I'm using Erepia. So keeping track of who helped me with each step is also very important, and it helps you keep track of where you're at in the process, and so you're not trying to hold all this in your mind, but when you come back to that particular portion, you just pick up where you left off and continue on. And it helps collaborate as well between different people that are responsible. For example, we get down into the content checking, and other people that are involved, you're going to want to enter their name and who they used as a translation helper, etc. So that's part of what I do. I have everything in a spreadsheet to keep track of where I'm at, and hopefully don't lose my place, be able to bring everything to the last and final step. This chart that we have on the wall here, this is a chart that I put up in my office. I noticed that the Moy people were beginning to take for granted the fact that we were living with them and we were involved in a project here, and they perhaps didn't realize that we had a starting point, middle point, and we had an ending point, and in what we hope to accomplish here in Moy, and and we needed them to realize that we're only here for a certain amount of time, and we need them to begin to take advantage of it, make the most out of it. So what we have here on the board is we have a chart up here at the top that represents Bible translation. This here is the book of Genesis, for example, and there are 2 rows of X's across the top. The first row represents steps 1 through 4 in our Bible translation procedure, coming up with an exegetical draft. The next row going across has to do with working with our mother tongue drafter to come up with a mother tongue draft. And as I do my job, and then as I work with them and we fill in their job, we begin to slowly fill in the boxes on this chart. When this chart is filled in, we can leave. We're done with the translation. This second row here has to do with literacy, and we've done the same thing for them. The first row has to do with my wife Carolyn and our Indonesian coworker. They taught through literacy together. They co-taught it with the Moy, and now the literacy program is run by the Moy themselves. The same way it goes with the lessons. They have to do with developing lessons, which Rich and I have been working on. We've done the lessons. We've corrected it with them. We've taught it by ourselves. We've taught it with them. They are now teaching it by themselves. And again, we're slowly working our way through the different lessons, the Old Testament, up into the Gospels, the book of Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, all the way into Revelation. And we still have some boxes to fill in here, but we're well on our way to filling in this chart. And when we're done, we're done. And we try to keep that in front of the Moy so that they take advantage of the time that we're in here. And it keeps us diligent too. It's rewarding to slowly fill things in and know that we're moving towards a completion.